Hello everybody and welcome to the All About Film for the Kodak Portra 160. This video discusses Kodak Portra 160 film and looks at how to use it, the film's characteristics, technical details, and sample images. Portra 160 is a medium speed film available in 35mm 120, 4x5, and 8x10 from Kodak on a regular basis. Film for Classics, as of the script authoring, also sells this stock in 620, 127, and 828 sizes. In all of those cases, those stocks are likely just 120 cut down to size. My best tip for this film is that it handles every subject well, insofar as I'm concerned. Though all portrait films are great, this one is decidedly the strongest of the three. 160 can handle people, buildings, landscapes, long exposures, basically anything you want to put in front of it. That it can be had in any of the formats for which Kodak produces film on a regular basis also makes it the most versatile of the Portra lineup. If you're looking for one portrait to use and don't need to shoot in low light, 160 is likely the one that you want. Now for this video, I shot exclusively at box speed, though with my medium and large format cameras, I don't use a light meter, so some of those images may have had exposure variances. Most of those variances would have been within the film's latitude, I would hope. That said, this film did handle exposure variances very well for me. For my preferred format, this may come as a surprise given the dearth of images in this video taken in this format, but it's 8x10. It's expensive to shoot Portra 160 in 8x10, and I really did only manage 4 usable-ish shots out of the 10 that I bought, and that's mostly owing to all but 2 of my 8x10 holders being north of a century old and not designed to be light-proof enough for color film. Anyway, the few images that I did return in 8x10 were interesting enough in their detail that I would jump at the chance to try this again in 8x10 and do better. My best tip for making the most out of this film is going to be master the cheaper color films first, and then this film. And when you think you have it nailed in 35mm, then try to shoot it in rolls and sheets for those of you who shoot larger than 35mm. This film will still have some surprises in store for you when you move up from 35mm, and not all of them are going to be pleasant. But when you learn to use this film well and then learn to use the larger formats than 35mm, quite honestly, the results from this film are going to be hard to match, possibly impossible to match. Grain is exceptionally fine, evidenced empirically by the PGI of 28, which is just a hair above what people can perceive at a typical viewing distance when a 35mm negative is enlarged 4 times. On larger than 35mm formats, the image reproduction ratio is small enough, and the negative is large enough that your images will be so smooth and grain-free that they may almost look fake. Tonality and tonal range are in line with other portrait films, quite good, but this film stock, to my eye, performs the best of the 3. 160 has excellent shadow and highlight retention in harsh lighting, and it also exhibits good tones and colors across the tonal range with suitable light. Acutance dances a fine line with Portra 160, sharp enough to allow the film to work well for landscapes and shots that require a lot of detail, but not so sharp that people are photographed in an unflattering way. Honestly, it's really kind of amazing, and well done to the Kodak engineers for designing the film this way. Contrast is nice, with contrast and the related color saturation that comes from it being rich and only slightly more saturated than real life. Sharpness will outdo many camera lenses. Details like the texture on walls, small branches on trees, and whiskers and beards are resolved well. Dynamic range is good with good lighting. You need a good lighting source and good lighting quality to get the most out of Portra 160. In good, and especially in full spectrum light, dynamic range is excellent. In poor lighting, such as overnight, dynamic range will suffer. Digital conversion is excellent, as that's a focus for Kodak's film engineers. Portra holds up very well whether it's scanned or digitized with a DSLR. As I recorded this video, I began switching over from lab scans of C41 negative film to digitizations at home with my Sony a7 IV and a raw file editing workflow. My technique is still evolving. And that said, so here are a series of 4x5 images comparing lab scans and my own home digitizations. I'm going to put them all in the same order, by the way, and I will put a dot in the top right of the image, which I preferred. Now, as I recorded this video, I began switching over from lab scans of C41 negative film to digitizations at home with my a7 IV and using a raw editing workflow to get the most out of those negatives. My technique is still evolving. That said, take a look at this series and decide which of the images you prefer. In all of these, the lab scan was the first image and the home digitization was the second. So I'd be interested to hear which set you preferred more of, as I was fairly well split. Now, as a note, the 8x10 images in this video were also digitized using my a7 IV. The spectral sensitivity curve is used to describe the film's relative sensitivity, which is on the y-axis, to the visible light colors, which are on the x-axis. As we saw previously in the Portra 800 video, the three color-forming layers peak at similar color sensitivities. That's between Portra 800 and Portra 160. Comparing Portra 160 to Portra 800, 160 has a slight warm tone peak more in the orange spectra and a blue peak that records a bit less purple, and a lower green-yellow peak. Good skin tones especially benefit from those warm tones being recorded on film in this manner, and darker skin tones need some of those blues as well. So what the spectral sensitivity curve here tells us is that this film will record skin tones well. As the best example I have, take a look at the photos of my dog Steinbeck in this video. Portra 160 recorded his brown fur tone well and very accurately. Another interesting aspect of this film is the very slightly lower green sensitivity compared to Portra 800. This film is, to my eye, meaningfully better at landscape work than is Portra 800, though the colors do seem slightly muted by the standards of many landscape film photographers' work. I really like the way that this film renders the world under full spectrum sunlight. Shooting landscapes and similar work with Portra 160 on sheet film is a great way to capture the world. And by the way, the similarity in the peaks between the peaks and valleys in the Portra films extends to 400 as well, which is why this film series is special. Portra is not just a film stock, a one-off that's its own thing. Portra is a series, and across this series, the films have highly comparable color tones and similarities. This means that the different Portras can be used with different lighting levels and still yield results that look the same. Once again, Kodak does not provide reciprocity failure data for this film in their datasheet, other than to say that filter adjustment is not needed from 1/10,000th of a second to a full second, and that beyond that, test it for yourself. So the best advice I have for you is this. If you want to do long exposures, experiment with a roll of 35mm and take detailed notes for each exposure setting, filtration, so on and so forth, time of day, length of exposure, aperture, etc., for each of your tests. So when you finish your test roll and you get your images back, what you're going to do then is you're going to take your data points and your sample photos and see what looks good in different settings. You don't want to just shoot 36 photos of waterfalls and shade. You want to use part of that test roll for waterfalls and shade, part of it for some astrophotography like star trails, things like that, part of it for very dark shade, whatever the different cases may be. And then you can compare your notes and those results to figure out what settings are going to work best for your artistic eye and workflow. As a note, Kodak, guys, come on. We're not asking for the emulsion formulation. We're asking to know about time and filter compensation for long exposures with this stock. The datasheet does not provide any information about exposure or development latitude. For the color films in this series, I expose exclusively at box speed, but given that much of my work is done without a light meter, even on 35mm, and that most of the images in this video have relatively good exposures, I can say that this film's exposure latitude is at least as good as my ability to eyeball lighting conditions and my ancient camera equipment's ability to provide accurate exposure timing and shutter speeds. In less than a year, I'll release my All About Film Kodak Portra 400 review as well. And sometime after that, the very much awaited and very long overdue comparison of the three stocks. But as these three Portra-related All About Film videos are now 2/3 done, one thing I can say that is, I think, highly important is that this film is engineered wonderfully, and the performance of this film across the stocks and over time, as I've used these films for many years now, shows consistency which results from the dedication and care put into this film's crafting and development. When we put our minds to it, humans can create amazing things. Planes that can outrun the sunset, computers that can design buildings, and films that can perform well across an entire series of related stocks. Is Portra missing anything? Yes, of course it is. A 25 ISO offering and a 1600 ISO offering top that list. But is Portra 160 missing anything? As a medium speed color negative offering, not really. Ektar makes us whiteys look like our moms dropped us off at the beach for the day and forgot to give us sunscreen. Gold gives people some too dark shadows around the angles of their faces sometimes. UltraMax, you know what? Forget it. I have. So Portra offers photographers who don't like those looks that the other films provide, with a stock that provides good performance across subjects and speed offerings. Portra 160 is truly a standout among Kodak's stocks, and while I still, personally, prefer the look that Ektar yields for my own work, I think that anyone who likes Portra 160 has a well-founded and good mindset on that. And, beyond that, I think a solid case exists for Portra 160 being, empirically, the best Kodak color negative film. I certainly would not argue against that, and really, I might even argue for it.